Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're tuning in, you're likely someone who wants to understand not just how the world works, but how you fit into it. Today, our mission is a big one.
It really is.
Yeah, we're going to unpack the very concept of you. Like, how do you actually know who you are? How much of your identity is actively chosen by you? And how much is just, well, just a script handed to you by society?
Right. That's the core question.
To help us navigate this, we're exploring a really fascinating textbook. It's called Introducing Intercultural Communication, Global Cultures and Contexts by Xuang Liu, Zala Voci, and Cindy Galloy. It's just a brilliant look at how culture and communication shape our reality.
It's a phenomenal source to unpack. We're going to be exploring the intricate web of individual and collective identities, the hidden scripts of society, the sometimes dark side of group categorization,
Yeah.
and ultimately how we can all become better intercultural communicators in a rapidly globalizing world. The goal is to understand the invisible forces that dictate our interactions, often without us even realizing it.
Before we jump in, I want you, the listener, to think about the groups you belong to. Think about your family, your profession, your nationality, your gender, maybe even your favorite sports team.
Right.
How do those invisible labels dictate your daily interactions? Keep that in the back of your mind as we go. Because, to kick things off, there is an amazing anecdote from a researcher named Dodd, written back in 1998, that illustrates how deeply our identity is tied to how we communicate.
Oh, the broadcasting student's story.
Yes, the story follows a university student from a rural area in the United States. He goes off to college to study broadcasting, and he realizes his rural accent isn't considered the standard for mass media. So he puts in the work and learns to speak with the standard, highly polished broadcasting accent.
That is a classic example of accommodation. He's adapting to the dominant communication style of his new professional and academic environment.
The catch is what happens when he goes back to his old environment. He heads home for Thanksgiving, he knocks on the door, calls out to his mom, and she literally locks him out of the house. Yeah, she refuses to open the door because she doesn't recognize his voice, and she demands he start talking right before she lets him in. He changed his communication style to fit a new professional identity, but in doing so, he violated the identity his family expected of him. I just wonder what that tells us about how fragile our sense of self really is.
Well, what's fascinating here is how clearly that story separates the two main levels of identity that the text defines. You have individual identity and you have collective identity.
Break those down for us.
Sure. Individual or personal identity refers to the things that make us distinct from others. It's your specific hobbies, your personal quirks, your physical features. Some of these are given to us at birth, like genetic characteristics, and others are created as we grow, learn, and socialize.
Okay.
But then you have collective or social identity. This is categorization based on group membership. It could be your gender, ethnicity, religion, or nationality.
So the broadcasting accent became part of his individual identity, but it clashed with his collective identity back home.
Exactly that tension.
Mm.
The text leans heavily on Tajfel's social identity theory here. Tajfel argues that identity formation is actually a product of social categorization. Is how we internalize society.
Internalized society.
Yeah, we adopt the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors of the groups we belong to, and that collective belonging often overrides our individual quirks.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it sounds like we aren't just one static thing. If I'm an employee, a sibling, a deep dive listener, and a sports fan, how do those all coexist?
The sociologist Manuel Castells addresses that directly in the text. He argues that identities are a plural process. We are a messy, overlapping combination of many identities all operating at once.
Sound exhausting.
It can be.
Yeah.
Castells points out that this plurality can actually be a massive source of stress and contradiction in our lives. We're constantly navigating which identity is most relevant in any given situation, and sometimes they conflict.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the balance between individual and collective identity varies wildly across different cultures.
How does that look in a culture that doesn't prioritize the individual the way Western societies often do? The text mentioned pre-colonial Maori society in what is today New Zealand as a prime example.
The Maori example perfectly illustrates a culture where identity was profoundly collective rather than individualistic. In that historical context, identity wasn't about what made you uniquely distinct as a solo operator. Your identity was determined by how well you fulfilled your social obligations to your biological kin.
Right.
It was structured through layers of community. You had the wano, which is the extended family, then the hapu, or subtribes, and the iwi, the larger tribes. You achieved social acceptance and a sense of purpose by honoring that collective mode of operation.
Yeah.
You were inextricably linked to the group. If you removed the group, the individual identity essentially ceased to have meaning.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How does society actually force these collective labels on us in the first place? Do we choose them, or are they assigned? The text introduces this concept from the French philosopher Louis Althusser called interpellation.
Interpellation is a brilliant framework for understanding this. Althusser uses a very simple spatial analogy. Imagine you're walking down the street and a police officer or a stranger yells out, "Hey, you!"
You naturally turn around.
Exactly. Society hails us in the exact same way. Society creates predefined categories based on class, gender, race, or profession. When society calls out that category and we recognize ourselves as the type of person being called, when we metaphorically turn around and answer the call, we accept the identity that society has ascribed to us.
So our sense of identity isn't just blooming organically from inside us. It's a reaction to the outside world categorizing us and us agreeing to play along.
That agreement is where the text differentiates between ascribed identities and avowed identities. Ascribed identities are the ones handed to you by society, often at birth, or simply by how you look. Avowed identities are the ones you actively claim for yourself.
And the friction happens when the identity you avow doesn't match the identity society ascribes to you.
Yes. This leads directly into the textbook's discussion on marked versus unmarked identities. The authors frame this by examining how sociology and cultural studies approach dominant societal categories. They look specifically at whiteness as a structural baseline in Western societies.
I noticed they drew heavily on the philosopher Frantz Fanon for that section.
They do. Drawing on Fanon's work, the text details how individuals in the majority, in this Western context, white individuals, are often completely unaware of belonging to a specific racial group. Because being white is the dominant norm in those societies, it's taken for granted.
Right.
It's considered an unmarked identity. It is the baseline from which everything else is measured. Meanwhile, individuals from minority backgrounds are hyper-aware of their racial or ethnic group membership because society constantly marks them as different from that baseline. They're constantly being hailed by their differences.
If society marks you as different, and that mark comes with a loss of social privilege or structural advantage, I imagine people might try to escape that categorization.
That is a well-documented sociological phenomenon known as passing. Passing occurs when a person attempts to move out of a marked disadvantaged group and blend into the majority or unmarked group. The goal is to access the opportunities, safety, and privileges reserved for the dominant members of society.
The text included a fascinating case study on this from Israel. It's a cultural phenomenon called hishtachnazut. Can you walk us through the mechanics of how that works in practice?
In the Israeli context, the sociological dynamic involves two main groups: Mizrahim, who are Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, and Ashkenazim, who are Jews of European origin.
Got it.
In this specific cultural landscape, Ashkenazim are generally considered the unmarked group. Because of their European origins, they represent the societal baseline or the dominant cultural norm. Mizrahim, however, are generally marked as the ethnic other, representing a historically disadvantaged group. Hishtachnazut refers to the process where Mizrahim mimic the practices, speech patterns, and behaviors of Ashkenazim to pass as unmarked.
The research notes that this strategy comes with a brutal psychological cost. It functions as a shaming interpellation.
The psychological toll is immense. Passing in this way entails a twofold sense of shame. First, there is the socially conditioned shame over one's actual ethnic origin, feeling that it's somehow less valuable. Second, there is the internal shame over having to conceal that origin by mimicking another group.
You're hiding who you are.
Right. The individual is forced to hide their authentic self to escape a socially unworthy position. It's a stark illustration of how powerful and pervasive ethnic hierarchies can be, and how much energy it takes to survive within them.
It sounds utterly exhausting to maintain that kind of facade day in and day out, which makes me wonder, is identity ever really a fixed thing we just possess? Or is it something we're constantly doing? The text brings in Stella Tingtumi's identity negotiation theory, which frames identity entirely as a performance.
Tingtumi argues that identity is a reflective self-image that we construct during communication. It's not static. We are constantly asserting, modifying, and challenging our desired self-images in real time when we interact with people.
So it's an active process.
Very active. You bring your desired identity to a conversation, but the other person also brings their expectations of who they think you are. Effective intercultural communication requires consciously attuning to your own identity issues while also respecting the identity the other person is trying to project.
The case study of the tour guides in Yunnan, China, really brought the mechanics of this theory to life. These guides interact with foreign tourists every single day. The research showed that when they meet these tourists, the guides have to negotiate their identities on the fly.
The dynamics of those interactions are incredibly complex. You have guides who are modern professionals, often highly educated, but the Western tourists arriving in Yunnan usually come with preconceived stereotypes. They want an authentic, exoticized ethnic experience.
Right. If the guide acts too modern or relies too heavily on their professional identity, it clashes with the fantasy the tourists paid for. So the research found that the guides actively negotiate their identity, choosing to prioritize and perform their ethnic identity over their professional one to match the expectation of the audience.
That is a perfect example of contextual identity. The guide is modulating their behavior to bridge a cultural gap, though it requires suppressing parts of their avowed identity to satisfy an ascribed stereotype.
Yeah.
And this raises an important question for individuals who live their entire lives between cultures. Think of immigrants or refugees. They experience what the text calls bicultural identity integration.
I want to ask you, the listener, have you ever felt like a completely different person depending on the language you're speaking or the country you happen to be in? That is cultural hybridity in action.
Immigrants often have to adopt these hybrid identities. They have to seamlessly transition between their heritage cultures and their host cultures.
It's like code switching on a massive scale.
Exactly. They might be one person at work, fully assimilated into the host culture's norms to succeed professionally, and a different person at home, deeply connected to their ethnic traditions to maintain family bonds. The degree to which an individual perceives these two elements of their bicultural identity as compatible or in conflict is what bicultural identity integration measures.
And when they conflict.
When the host culture demands total assimilation, that integration feels like a severe conflict, creating a heavy psychological burden.
That tension transitions us to what the text calls the dark side of identity. We've talked about how categorization makes the complex world easier to process and gives a structure. But the dark side is that categorization inherently creates strict boundaries. It builds walls. It creates an us versus them divide.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this divide is fueled by a fundamental cognitive bias known as the outgroup homogeneity effect.
Break that down.
When we look at our own group, our in-group, we see incredible nuance. We see individuals with different personalities, varying beliefs, and unique traits. We forgive our in-group members for their mistakes because we view them as complex humans.
But when we look outside our group,
When we look at an out-group, a group we don't belong to, we tend to view them as a monolith. We think they're all alike.
that cognitive bias feels like the exact soil where stereotypes and prejudice grow. The text references a massive study by Orb and Kamara to show how this plays out in everyday life. They collected 957 stories of everyday discrimination from a highly diverse group of people.
The scope of that study is vital. They looked at discrimination based on race, gender, age, sexual orientation, and physical abilities. What they found was that people make sense of this everyday marginalization through life scripts and archetypes.
It's not always the big, obvious events.
Right. Discrimination isn't always a massive, overt event that makes the evening news. It's often deeply embedded in the everyday communication contracts and speech acts that minority individuals have to navigate constantly. It's the subtle, recurring microsignals, a tone of voice, an assumption about intelligence being followed in a store. They constantly remind an individual they are an outgroup member.
The text highlights a poignant example of the toll this takes, focusing on adopted children. Based on Argent's research, children adopted from minority backgrounds into families of a dominant culture face an incredibly heavy psychological burden.
The adoptee experience in this context is a powerful lens for identity theory. These children are forced to internalize the dominant culture's norms to survive and bond within their new families. They're asked to accept an identity that might fundamentally conflict with their physical origins or their ascribed heritage.
They're stuck in the middle.
Yes, they end up living constantly on the boundary of the in-group and the out-group, sometimes feeling alienated from their heritage culture while never fully being accepted as an unmarked member of their adoptive culture.
It shows how forced assimilation demands that marginalized subgroups erase parts of their foundational identity. It's a demand for homogenization that inherently devalues their original cultural schema.
Precisely why understanding these dynamics is so critical.
So what does this all mean? We've explored how identity is categorized, how society hails us into roles through interpellation, how we negotiate our bicultural lives on the fly, and the dark biases of in-groups and out-groups. How do you, the listener, actually use this information to navigate the world better?
The text offers a very practical roadmap for this, specifically Milton Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or the DMIS framework.
Okay, the DMIS framework.
Bennett observed that as people become more confident at intercultural communication, they move through predictable stages regarding how they experience cultural differences.
Walk us through how a person moves through that continuum.
Bennett divides the continuum into two main phases. On one side, you have the ethnocentric stages. In these early stages, a person views their own culture as central to reality.
Makes sense as a starting point.
Right. The first stage is denial, where a person simply doesn't notice cultural differences or isolates themselves from them entirely. If forced to confront difference, they move to defense, where they view other cultures as a threat to their own, leading to an us versus them mentality.
I can definitely see that happening in the real world.
Then some eventually move to minimization, where they acknowledge superficial differences like food or dress, but insist that deep down, everyone is just like me. That essentially erases the valid, profound differences in how other cultures view the world.
And the goal is to break out of that ethnocentric mindset and move toward the ethnorelative stages.
That is the turning point. In the ethnorelative stages, a person's mindset fundamentally shifts. They reach acceptance, realizing their own culture is just one of many equally valid ways of experiencing the world.
And after acceptance.
From there, they move to adaptation, where they can actively shift their perspective and intentionally alter their communication style to empathize with another culture. Finally, they reach integration, where diverse cultural elements are incorporated into their own flexible, bicultural or multicultural identity.
Developing that kind of intercultural identity requires us to abandon the unexamined identity. We have to stop blindly accepting the dominant norms we were handed at birth. It means actively recognizing differences and choosing to negotiate them. It isn't just about tolerating someone else from a distance. It's about informing yourself, learning from their worldview, and compromising to reach a mutual consensus.
It's a profound shift in how you view yourself. It is moving from thinking of identity as a wall that protects you from the outside world to thinking of identity as a bridge that connects you to it. An effective intercultural communicator doesn't exclude possibilities beyond their own established cultural boundaries. They actively reach out and negotiate the space between.
This has been an incredible journey through the source material. We've seen that identity is not just a static label you wear on your shirt. It's an ongoing performance. It's a real-time negotiation. And sometimes it's a literal battleground between who we feel we are internally and who society demands we be externally.
As we conclude, I'd encourage you to think about what the text calls your invisible backpack. We all carry one. It's filled with the unspoken assumptions, the hidden privileges, and the subtle stereotypes we hold about other subcultures. The first step to moving from ethnocentric to ethnorelative is to take off that backpack, open it up, and honestly unpack what you've been carrying around. Once you recognize those assumptions, you can begin to dismantle them.
I love that visual, unpack the backpack. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, lingering question to ponder on your own. It builds on everything we've explored today. If our identities are largely scripts handed to us by society through interpellation, if culture is constantly out there on the street hailing us, calling out our predefined categories, what would happen if you simply decided to stop answering the call and started writing a completely new script for yourself? Think about it. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.